Actually, that's our last session today, is around the future for science and medicine and the way we do research. So please, can I invite the panelists to join me here on the stage? We have an excellent group of colleagues who are being chaired by Andrew Jack, who will appear. Here he is. Andrew Jack is going to, from the FT, of course, is going to be chairing this group, but we have some really excellent points of view coming across from a range of sectors. So we have Duncan McHale, who's here representing UCB. For those who don't know Duncan, he leads the work at UCB on global exploratory development. Joe Pisani, for those who haven't met Joe yet, is from the strategy group at PwC. And in fact, if anyone has any questions on Brexit, she's your lady. And of course, we have Professor Sue Hill, who's the Chief Scientific Officer from NHS England. Sir Harpal Kumar, of course, from CRUK, and finally, Dr. Louise Wood from NHS. So over to you all. I'll step quietly to the side.
Thanks very much. Welcome, everyone, and congratulations for keeping so tightly on schedule and for such a really interesting discussion. So we'll now head into our final session of the day, kind of drawing together perhaps some of the big themes with some very good speakers. And I'm told it's all chat, no formal presentations on this to keep it dynamic. Very keen to hear also some reflections from you. But I'd like to go around initially our participants and hear in a few minutes each a little bit their thoughts on really kind of big radical R&D innovations that we've seen during your professional lifetimes, looking at this whole space of medical innovation and reflecting a little bit on the next stages, the next steps, the big challenges ahead, the things that could really catalyse, the new breakthroughs to come. So let's start perhaps with Harpal Kumar, Head of Cancer Research, to kick us off.
Thank you, Andrew. So great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So my task is to talk about what do I think has been a really exciting development and what do I see coming down the track. So I've been at Cancer Research UK for 14 years now, and of course over that time we've seen a vast array of new technologies, new breakthroughs, things that have really helped us transform survival in cancer. And you might expect me to talk about things like immunotherapy or screening and so on, but what I've chosen to just pick on is the fantastic advances that have been delivered through genomics and transcriptomics over the last 10 or so years. And lots of people here will know about what's happened in this world, the fact that it used to take us 10 years and $3 billion to sequence a human genome, and now we can do it for, less than $1,000 in 2 days. And lots of people think about sort of whole-scale genomics in that context, but actually what it's delivered for us is fundamental across so many different areas. So just to pick on a couple, the use of these technologies has really enabled us to interrogate the biology of cancer in ways that we couldn't previously have imagined. And we now understand that cancer is an evolving disease. There's huge amounts of heterogeneity, and that helps to explain why some things work well and some things don't work well. We now know breast cancer is at least 10 different diseases when we used to think of it as one disease. So there's a huge amount that we've learned in terms of our understanding. We've learned a huge amount in terms of how we can prevent cancer. And we don't tend to think about genomics in the context of prevention, but applications of genomics have helped us to understand particular causes. So there's a great example of a very high incidence of kidney and urinary tract cancers in Romania. And it turns out that it's all derived from a weed that grows with a local wheat plant. And the same thing is happening in Taiwan, where this same weed is responsible for a high incidence of urinary tract cancers. Well, we can now do something about that. And so the use of genomics in an area like prevention has been profoundly important. And of course, in personalised medicine and precision medicine is where we tend to think about it most. And the area that I think is going to be of huge significance in the years ahead is in using these technologies in terms of being able to move medicine upstream. So I've touched on prevention, but the really big hope for me is that we get much, much better at earlier detection of all diseases, of which cancer is a great example, but of all diseases. And the use of genomics in the arena of being able to look at circulating DNA, both from cancers but also from inherited predisposition will enable us to think about prevention and earlier detection in a far more sophisticated way in the future, and really be able to, as I say, to shift medicine upstream, which will have a number of implications. It will massively improve outcomes. It will massively improve the cost effectiveness of our expenditure on health. But it will also yield big, important questions for us. So these technologies are going to mean that we discover things we didn't know about and didn't suspect. And the whole ethics of how we deal with those situations is going to be really important. The whole issue of how we determine when something is significant and we should treat it versus when something is not significant and we should just leave it alone is going to be a hugely challenging question for us. But these are questions that I think will be in the context of a really big opportunity for us to do some fantastic new work going forward that will transform outcomes. I'm very clear about that.
Thanks, and some very good things that we can come back to a little bit later in the discussion. But Duncan, first of all, for you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So I suppose I'll pick a therapeutic scheme as I come back. When I went through med school, we had small chemicals, and we were getting better at small chemicals, more potent, but I see one of the big changes that I've seen in my lifetime is monoclonal antibody therapies have come through, and then they've revolutionized people's lives suffering from immunoinflammatory conditions. Now we're seeing them in some of the oncology space as well, really making a big difference to patients. And I think that's a huge kind of medical innovation, a complete new therapeutic class coming forwards. And I think one of the things sitting here now looking forwards is the future's tremendously bright if you look at the opportunity we've got. We've got small chemicals, we've got monoclonal antibodies, but now we've got cell therapies coming, we've got gene therapies in certain areas, we've got nucleotide therapies, cyclic peptides. There's a huge amount of therapeutic modality that is starting to open up for us to pick on to some of the genomics and understanding of the disease. But it's not only that. If you look at the technologies that are out there as well, we can now detect Parkinson's disease therapy monitoring using the speed with which people text. You can actually diagnose it by actually looking at texting patterns. You can look at GPS movements on a phone and look to see how people are doing from their psychiatric illness and how that's affecting them at the minute. So there is technology coming that could make a huge impact to us all, and we all will be patients at one point or other in our lives. So I think the future's tremendously bright, but I think the future's tremendously challenging as well. Because the question is, how as a society can we get to affordable medical innovation? And we could sort of say, industry needs to solve this. It needs to be more efficient, more effective, and do things cheaper. And we can say, society, the government needs to solve this. We don't spend enough of our GDP on healthcare in the UK. We're not prepared to pay for drugs. But in truth, this is a societal challenge with a huge prize at the end of it. We know with some of these diseases, which we can detect earlier, if you hit that disease hard with the right combination of therapies, you can probably really disease modify and stop that disease process from going further. But we have to create a framework with which we can sort of fund that, get it accessible to patients, and get it to patients quickly enough. So I think the future's hugely bright. But we have a challenge here as to how can we work together to get medical innovation to patients who need it at the right time.
Thanks. I should say I didn't introduce, but you're a clinical geneticist, but you also work at UCB very much and move from research and practice into development as well. Yeah. Thanks very much. Louise Wood from Department of Health, maybe say a little bit about also exactly your role for anyone who doesn't know, and then those same thoughts about what's changed radically and how things might evolve.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Director of Science, Research and Evidence at the Department of Health, which means that I have responsibility for the NIHR. I'm actually a biomedical scientist by background, so in thinking about the exam question, I thought, will I go for immunotherapy? Will I go for genomics? Will I go for 3D printing? What about gene therapy? Etc., etc. There's so much exciting stuff coming down the line. But when I think about impact, and excitement, I don't just think about the scientific elements. I think about the impact on patients. So I'm going to go for a very different innovation, which is cognitive behavioural therapy. So if we look at something that has had a massive impact on so many people in this country and internationally, cognitive behavioural therapy is one of those things. It's one of the things that the NIHR funded the research which enabled the evidence base to be developed to show evidence of efficacy and effectiveness. So we can make an impact on people's life through high technology, but also through an intervention which puts power in patients' hands, CBT. Looking to the future, many colleagues in this room will have heard me talk about the huge power I think there is in patient data for care and research. And despite the challenges that we face, we have made big progress there. But our opportunity for the future isn't just around our patient record data from direct care. It's stuff that we're getting from apps. It's how we deal with the genomic data, how we link that with microbiome data, how we link that with phenotypic data we're collecting through our own apps and so on. So I think artificial intelligence and advanced analytics will be critically important and offer huge opportunities, but they also offer a big challenge because there is a huge possibility of people taking data and us having an explosion of random associations that are not supported by any form of vigorous evidence or research. So it's how we support that industry in a robust framework of real evidence generation.
Interesting thoughts, and particularly the focus on the non-medicine related aspects, as it were, therapy more generally, and technology and data. Thanks, Joe Pisani.
Oh, okay. Thanks a lot,
PwC,
Andrew, and thanks to the AMRC and the ABPI for inviting me to speak today. I'm an engineer, so I'm quite practical, actually, and I'd like to sort of talk about innovations in diagnostics, which I think bring together some of the themes that we've seen here. So I think diagnostics are key. I mean, we produce a forward-looking series called Pharma 2020. In 2007, we were bemoaning the lack of R&D productivity and potential areas that science could go into. There's been an explosion of science, as Duncan and Harpal have explained here. And I think the question about getting affordable care to the right patients at the right time is diagnostics. And seeing some good examples of that, but also lots of potential opportunity as well. Some good examples recently that you might have seen in the areas of things like antimicrobial resistance. Now, you'll be familiar about the challenge around that. And quite frankly, the antibiotics that a lot of the companies, including the one that I used to work for, GSK, we came up with antibiotics in the 80s and 90s. And those antibiotics are now getting resistance out in the community. And in fact, there's a requirement to get more antibiotics out there, new innovative ones, but also an effective way of screening patients to actually see is it effective to use antibiotics or not. And I was really pleased to see the NHS Innovation Accelerator 2 weeks ago come up with the sore throat test and screen opportunity. I don't know if many people here are aware of this. But this is the idea, if you've got a sore throat and you can go into your pharmacist, it's a very rapid point-of-care test that can say if it's bacterial or viral. And therefore, you can actually determine which treatment path to go down and avoid the unnecessary and ineffective prescribing of antibiotics. And that would save the NHS alone 34 million, save on 800,000 GP consultations, and also begin to tackle the area of growing resistance for bugs to antibiotics. So I think that's a really interesting historical one that's recently come to market there. In fact, a lot more effort needs to be done in that space. Looking forward, I think what you've got now is really the collaboration of biologists, clinicians, but also engineers, behavioural scientists, etc., talking about the area of diagnostics and what to do next. And really companies like Quantum MDX, who are looking at cheap molecular diagnostics at speed, molecular diagnostics in minutes, really focused on developing countries and coming up with cheap tests for looking at TB and screening TB and malaria and other sorts of forms. Now, their collaboration and their technology comes from the interface of the telecoms engineers with the electronics engineers and the biologists as well, so seeing some innovation there. You're also seeing people like Qualcomm. I don't know if many people are aware of Qualcomm. They're a telecoms company, and they produce chips that go into most of the smartphone devices that we use today. Now, they've launched something called the X Prize, which is actually looking in the realms of Star Trek. So it's, I don't know if people remember Dr. McCoy with his tricorder, where he used to do a rapid screen and tell if Captain Kirk is okay or not. But they've launched the Tricorder Prize, and that's really to come up with a device that can screen for 13 disease areas, including HIV, melanoma, COPD, amongst a lot of things. And the device has to weigh less than 5 pounds. So this is the challenge. There's a $10 million prize. And I understand there's some finalists, so we should hear more about that next year. So I think it's a fascinating area in terms of diagnostics coming forward. It's all around collaboration. It's multidisciplinary collaboration. And it's also adaptation within the healthcare systems to make sure that we adopt those sorts of new technologies in an effective way, because there's no question about it. I believe they are really essential in providing cost-effective medication to the UK population.
Thanks very much. So Sue Hill from NHS England.
Thank you very much. So I'm a respiratory scientist by background. In my role as Chief Scientific Officer for NHS England and working across the health system, I'm responsible for some 50 different scientific specialisms within the NHS. And more recently, I've been leading the NHS response to the 100,000 Genomes Project and creating what will be the legacy within the NHS for genomics. And I look back now over what is a 40-year career in the NHS and academia and think about what has changed. And I think there are 5 things that have changed. Firstly, technology. When I first started, we needed a whole laboratory to make a number of different respiratory measurements that we can now make on a handheld device. That can be done by the patient or indeed within the GP surgery. And there are technological advances in many different parts of medicine that have really fundamentally changed over the last 40 years or so. That's driven our ability to have devices that have been handheld and can be support point of care testing close to the patient, through to driving robotic platforms, molecular platforms for testing, for genomic testing at scale and at pace. The second is, over that 40 years, there's been a total explosion in the type of diagnostic tests that are available within the NHS now. Just in pathology alone, there are now over 800,000 tests done every year. 800 million, I mean, close to getting on to 1 billion. And they cover a vast repertoire of over 3,000 different tests. That has changed significantly, and therefore our ability to properly characterize disease, but also to understand how a disease changes within an individual or where other diseases comes in, means that we've got a lot more available in the NHS to properly diagnose, care and manage patients. The third change has been in the interventions, and those interventions have been both in the biotech industry. We now have implantable defibrillators. We have a raft of other devices that allow us, for example, to do extremely complex open heart and lung surgery. And alongside that, there have been similar developments in the pharma industry, such that we've started to move from a one-size-fits-all medicine approach to something that's much more stratified. The fourth major change has been in data, our ability to handle data and to think about the enormous sums of data that's generated in the NHS every single day in this country, and to bring that together and to apply the artificial learning and other algorithms to bring better patient outcomes to the future, which we've moved from something that's all been very much paper-based through to electronic patient records, and then the collation of data and the integration of data. The final area for me has been in patient and public participation. In 1990, I tried to get a paper published, and I presented at many conferences that actually started to compare what patients actually felt about their condition against very objective measures. It took me 18 months to get that paper published because people didn't believe that patients actually could record how they felt every day, and that would be meaningful and measurable. How far we've come since that time, and I'm actually delighted to see that we have patients involved, for example, actively in our 13 NHS Genomic Medicine centres that we've established as part of the NHS response to the 100,000 Genomes project. In terms of looking forward and what our vision is within NHS England, is to use all of those 5 different elements and bring them together into a personalised medicine strategy that builds upon the legacy of the 100,000 Genomes project that you've heard about, but that really drives the 4 Ps of personalised medicine. One, a more predictive and preventative approach to healthcare. Secondly, a more precise diagnosis for patients made much earlier, so there's much better outcomes. The third is to use genomics to characterise the underlying cause with other cutting-edge diagnostics to drive a personalised treatment intervention for patients, particularly driving the conversation when drugs won't be effective and we have high numbers of adverse drug reactions. 1 in 15 hospital episodes are associated with adverse drug reactions that we can do something about. And then finally, and most importantly within the strategy, as a more participatory role for patients and the public and the patient groups that work with them, but set within a more holistic view of that patient and how they manage their disease. I'd just like to remind you all that in the NHS we spend around £15 billion every year on drugs, around £10 billion on diagnostics, and we don't bring the two together. This is our real opportunity to do that and to really drive better outcomes for patients and our public.
So thanks very much all for some very good and succinct, thoughtful reflections. I'm going to come in a second to kind of the business models, the economic models, as it were, and the science. But first, I mean, great to see this gender representation on this panel. And I use that pointedly because I think one thing that no one's really, well, you touched on it a little bit there at the end, Sue, but representational issues, if I can put it that way. Because, of course, another thing that's changed, seems to me, in the last 10, 20 years is the role of women in science, for example, and indeed in decision-making roles, but also kind of throwing it forward and thinking a little bit perhaps in clinical trials, for example, as well. I wonder if anyone's got any reflections both on, you know, the impact and perhaps the next stage around both, you know, gender balance, but also perhaps patient groups that have been underrepresented, for example, in the past, both in terms of a voice, but also in terms of representativeness as patients in trials, and thinking about the broader issues of prevention as well that you touched upon.
I'm very happy to sort of start on that. I mean, I'll talk about participation in trials. I guess that's probably the closest one to me. When I joined industry 20 years ago, really, we didn't like to include women in trials, particularly the early trials. And there was this very much an ethos of, till you've got all of your reproductive toxicology in there, until you really need to. So healthy volunteer studies were effectively male studies. They were very rarely brought women in at the beginning. And we have seen a transition now to a real desire to have a much more balanced, you know, when we do healthy volunteers, we have a much more balanced gender distribution there. We accept that we have to have the right reproductive sort of checks in there, that we don't inadvertently allow, not we allow women, but women don't inadvertently become pregnant on a novel mechanism that we don't understand. And that is getting better. And also, you know, particularly in the immunoinflammation area, where actually ultimately the predominant sort of patient population is more female than male, we are actually starting to get that right. I still think there's more to be done. So I think that's important. And in terms of population, certainly something that's very close to our heart at the minute at UCB is women of childbearing potential, and how do you develop therapies and how do you gain information about whether that therapy will be safe in pregnancy, and what is the benefit risk there of a therapy. And we've certainly now got a sort of a particular mission as part of the organization. And we're not the only company doing this, I'm sure, but a mission there to sort of say, this is a really important part of the population, women with childbearing potential. How can we make sure we get the right information? And how can we make sure we get that information to those patients? So it's really nice to see that as a much more proactive kind of view than it has been in the past. And in fact, similarly in pediatrics as well, we're sort of really trying to get pediatrics in earlier. Some of the conditions we treat with some of our anti-epilepsy drugs that we develop, really we want to get into children really quite early because they're the patients who may well get the most benefit from them. And we're really trying hard to work with patient groups, to work with carers when we think about children, I guess, and to sort of see how we can get the right information to sort of patients, to parents, to carers, have the right discussion about the benefit risk of allowing those folks into the clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
Just while we're on the theme of patient participation in trials, I mean, I think from my perspective that successfully we've managed to relax some of the eligibility criteria over recent years, and so trials are now open to a wider population set than previously used to be the case. But I think, I mean, I would point to three challenges that we still have. The first, in no particular order, the first is actually in cancer we've been very successful at getting children into trials, but we've been much less successful at getting teenagers and young adults into trials. And so you can absolutely track that we've made lots of progress in lots of pediatric cancers. We haven't yet made as much progress in cancers that affect teenagers and young adults. So that's one challenge. A second challenge right at the other end of the spectrum is the very elderly, actually, where we're dealing with multiple conditions typically, and how we actually design trials to deal with those multiple conditions and get the answers that we want, you know, from our perspective for cancer, but also for how it interacts across all the other conditions that they may be facing and dealing with. And then the third area that I would point to is we still struggle to get what I would call good ethnic minority representation into some of our trials. And that's a more general problem about ethnic minorities accessing healthcare, whether that be from sort of prevention type services to screening type services, but it also then translates into research.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else like to come on?
Just to pick up, really, I think Harpal's absolutely right. We do have to think about both the ethnicity and the diversity elements of participation, and to monitor that quite rigorously and think about the enablers that bring people into trials. What I'm really keen to do, though, is to start to look at how NHS routine care, and this is exemplified in the 100,000 Genomes Project, where we use patients who are being seen every day and their data that's being generated for use in clinical trials, whether that's by academia, whether it's by medical research charities and through NIHR. So it's thinking about a new relationship in terms of being reflective of our population, but utilising the unique data that's generated in the NHS in a different way, in new partnerships with industry, with academia, with patients and patients groups and charities.
I just wanted to, it's a request, I guess. So ethnic diversity is clearly not something that we kind of aim for in terms of eligibility criteria. We try to be, you know, we don't exclude, in fact, I've never run a trial where we've excluded particular ethnic groups or individual particular ethnic backgrounds. But one of the challenges is we don't get that diversity in the trials. And I think any help that folks here have got from the patient groups or to actually think about, why are we getting this wrong? What is it that we are doing that means we can't get that group into the trials? Because we really would like, as representative population as we can, into these clinical trials. But we do struggle, and it's, you know, it's still predominantly Caucasian trials. And so any help folks have from the patient groups from that they could give us, I'd love to hear it, because it's sort of say it's something that we never aim for, but that's what we end up with, and it's not where we want to be.
I'm going to open it up in a minute, but let's just talk a little bit on the sort of resourcing or funding side, and just think, we've talked about, you mentioned stratified medicine, Harpal's talked about earlier stage prevention, as it were, going upstream. Obviously, a lot of pretty high-priced therapies, particularly for orphan diseases and so on. How's this model going to have to evolve in the next few years to create something that's still sustainable, affordable, accessible? Anyone want to come in on that?
I guess, I mean,
Why don't you start?
we consult a lot on those,
Yeah.
those sorts of schemes. And I guess you move to the value-based pricing sort of era, so actually paying for outcomes. Now, there's a lot of uncertainties around that. You need to measure that the outcome is effective. You need to be sure that it's your drug that is responsible for the efficacy that you're seeing. And in fact, it's not your results not necessarily being skewed by other sort of lifestyle things or other medicines that an individual might be taking. So in fact, it's very, very complex as a mechanism that we've seen. And we've not seen any country around the world that systematically applies value-based pricing. But what we have seen is it being applied to individual products. And many of you might have been following the hepatitis C innovations this year, led by Gilead and Solvardi, etc., which I think really challenged the conventional commercial models. Solvardi is and other products as well, 10-week oral therapies that cure hepatitis C. So absolutely sort of unheard of in terms of those innovative steps that makes. And in fact, from a health economics benefit, no question about it, you're avoiding potentially a liver transplant in 10 years' time and also controlling reinfection risk for really quite a chaotic population. So there's no question about it that more of a value-based pricing scheme might work. But in fact, when we try and apply it to different health economies, it's quite challenging. You're almost looking at a treat now, pay later, or treat now and pay over a 10-year period. And in fact, a lot of our healthcare systems aren't yet mature enough to manage those sorts of innovations coming through. So to answer your question, Andrew, I think there are innovative schemes out there, but they're being pushed very much by the individual companies just now. So it'll be interesting to see what the other panel think about, could there possibly be a system-wide approach? Sorry, I'm doing your job.
Who wants to come in? Yeah.
Well, I think there has to be a system-wide approach. I think that whether it's 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we have to get to a point where actually our approach isn't to price individual technologies, but rather to price whether it's episodes of care or treatment pathways that lead to the outcomes that we want. Because if we persist with this approach of pricing individual technologies, we will persist with being in the problems that we have now, which frankly is about unsustainability and this sort of constant competitive pressure. And actually what we need to get to is an approach which says we have a certain amount of money that we can afford to spend to get to certain outcomes. How do we best use that money effectively across the system? And everything else that everyone else has said about the use of diagnostics, about the use of data, can facilitate that. And being the optimist that I am, I would say that the UK is probably in a better position to design whatever this new system looks like than probably any other healthcare system in the world, actually. Mm-hmm. And so we have a responsibility to do that. So I think that's one part of the answer. I do think the second part of the answer is what I talked about earlier, which is shifting upstream. We have to be able to prevent more, and we have to be able to detect at a stage where the interventions are less expensive than they are when we get to very, very expensive disease. So I think it's a combination of those two things that we need to do.
Two.
Just speaking from NHS England's perspective, I think this was what was the driving force behind the personalised medicine strategy we launched at NHS Expo, which is we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try and get this right, to look at this in terms of a patient pathway, an end-to-end patient pathway, but in what might be a clinical journey for a patient, but make sure that what underpins it is an infrastructure that's flexible and responsive, because that's part of the problem we have at the moment, the number of perverse incentives within a commissioning system. Some of this is going back to basics and looking across sort of particular clinical pathways and understanding what we should do where, and where we can do things at a higher level of aggregation in the service, such that it's done on robotic platforms where the cost comes down considerably. And it might be we do more diagnostics, but we actually get more information at a one-off time to drive that whole personalised medicine agenda. And I think certainly the board in NHS England is up for that, but also it's now that the time is ripe to actually think about this new relationship between the NHS, between the research, and building upon the fantastic work that NIHR has done in this area, and working with NIHR and others, with industry and with academia, to think about a new model for the future, in terms of also a new model of pricing for drugs and for biotech. And that's the way that we will make this affordable, sustainable and systematic.
So just to be a little bit provocative in the afternoon, one of the challenges potentially here is that I don't think pricing on its own is an answer to this. I think early diagnosis is great, it will provide great opportunities, but also it will create costs to the healthcare system, because we can predict, those people who are at significant risk of Alzheimer's 10 years before really you're starting to get your mild cognitive impairment. We could screen people, and there are therapies. Now you may sort of say, the sort of beta amyloid therapies, they failed in mild to moderate Alzheimer's. They probably need to be used 10 years earlier. So I think there's great opportunities for patients there with early diagnosis and with some of those therapies, but I'm not sure that price on its own or early diagnosis is going to help the system here. And in fact, transiently, it may put more demand on the system to actually afford the therapies early on. And the stratified medicines, for me, again, it's a great opportunity, but if we look at disease biology, what you're quite often seeing is subgroups that are needing 1, 2, or 3 therapies rather than necessarily each individual as a separate one. So for me, the other piece that we must tackle is the cost of drug development and how much it's costing us to get there. If we have to do 5, 6, 7,000 patient clinical trial packages, randomized controlled trials going forwards, and it's 100,000 pounds per patient, you can start to see that very quickly you rack up the development costs that somehow, the companies have to be able to sort of make a return for their investors. So I think we need to think about what is the right way to do that development. How can we use accelerated access review, get therapies out more effectively to the patient population, use the technology to bring the data back in a way that gives us robustness about the value that is bringing to patients. We must be robust about the patient safety, but I think there are cost-effective ways we can work together as a partnership to drive those costs down. And I think we have to drive those costs down, as well as pick up all the sort of very good points here about early therapies and the other things that we can do.
And I don't know whether Louise or Sue, but obviously on the prevention side, of course, one of the challenges, as we know, is you talked about this sort of fragmentation of commissioning. Public health, as we know, is kind of even local authorities and under a lot of pressure. And of course, the returns that one sees could be a number of years down the road. So quite difficult politically, as well as organisationally, perhaps, to invest more in prevention compared to, drug development or diagnostic development.
But we need to look at that holistically. So at the moment, in terms of public health, we have got a bit of a dichotomy between the practice and the policy. We need to look at our public health research workforce, bearing in mind that many public health innovations did not come from someone labelled public health. So if we look at the training needs of our health professionals of the future, what are they going to need to be research literate? They're all going to need something around genomics, they're all going to need something around data, etc. But what are we doing about embedding public health more holistically within medical training so that it's seen as something that underpins our approach to health and disease in this country, and it's not seen as a specialty way off over here. It's mainstreamed.
Okay, thanks. So let's open it up. I think we've got at the front some patient organisations. Maybe if anybody there's got some initial reflections or questions from the panel. Any volunteers who might like to come in? Yeah, do say who you are, please, as well.
Yeah, I'm a a carer member of One Cancer Research UK's patient sounding boards. I wonder if I might just sort of draw this session about the future back to the theme of the conference. And we've heard a bit from Sue Hill, but what role do the panel members see patients and the public having in driving forward the developments that we've been hearing about?
Okay, anybody else maybe on that theme, or another question? Is on? Yeah.
Well, it's really following on from Jim's point. My name's Richard Stevens. I'm a cancer patient. What you've talked about is actually various forms of specialism. So if you do see a part for patients to play in driving this agenda, who is going to support them and who is going to cover the extra training that the patients are going to need, never mind the clinicians and the researchers?
Okay, maybe we'll take those two a little bit together. Do you want to come in?
So I think a key role for patients is going to be in the defining of the outcomes that are most important to them. So we've had a lot of effort on defining the research questions that are of importance to them, but we've had less focus on in the assessment of interventions about the outcomes that are most important to patients, which are often around quality of life. So it's more of a non-medical element in that assessment. I think the other key role that patients have got is to work with research funders as ambassadors for research and the importance of research. We touched on multimorbidities. 1 in 5 of us has multimorbidities or comorbidities, as Jane talked about this morning. That's even more important for the elderly population. We're going to have to think about new ways of conducting research, as a couple of the panel have touched upon, to address that. It's going to be a particular issue for our elderly population. We know from data that the elderly populations are moving out of cities into rural or semi-rural areas. Therefore, we're going to have to give much more thought to where research is conducted and by whom, because patients aren't congregated around the big teaching hospitals. So I think there's a massive opportunity for patients, particularly working within patient research charities, to really champion what are the key questions, but also to work to help to bring the patient community together to say, and we want to be participating with you right from research question conception through to implementation once the results are there.
Any interesting pilots through DOH or NIHR, for example, about patient engagement, or thoughts on how you might sort of embed some of that sort of infrastructure to incentivise, to help train and support the patient engagement?
So it's something that's been fundamental to NIHR from day one, and I'm going to be really naughty and say to Simon de Negri, go on, you 2 minutes of fame on this for this particular issue. Yeah.
So thank you for that, Louise. I half suspected that would happen. So yes, since 2006, I think NIHR has had a very solid approach to this by expecting all researchers and infrastructure and institutions that come to us to apply for funding to involve the public in generating that idea behind what they're trying to do, but then follow it through in terms of design and dissemination. There's no suggestion that we're absolutely perfect in this, but I think we have started a culture change by putting our head above the parapet and saying this is going to be a key principle to how we operate. And I think what we'd like to see is many other research partners across the system do exactly the same, because I think it's only by doing that that we're going to begin to tackle and succeed in tackling many of the challenges the panel have already identified.
Who else might like to comment on the patient engagement side? Yeah.
Can I just pick up on the education and training point that Richard made? I don't think we've got all the answers to how patients and carers can be supported in education and training. Part of it will be working with the charity sector in that area. But I just want to tell you a recent experience which relates to introducing a whole series of genomic education and training interventions to underpin the 100,000 Genomes project. And those, and they range from short online courses right up to an MSc in genomic medicine. And they've been supported in terms of that work's been sponsored by the Department of Health. But that's been open to patients and to healthcare professionals as well. It's not been confined. And it's been really interesting to see the number of patients who've taken up those interventions, and also who've asked to be enrolled on the MSc in genomic medicine. It's a very small number, but I do think we have to think about how we involve patients in our education and training process for the future, both in terms of the prospective workforce, how they're trained at the very beginning, but equally for the people we have in post now. And so that they systematically involve patients in the public in whatever they do, whether it's about their NHS service, their research and development type of activity, or anything that relates to the health service or health in its broadest sense. That may be quite aspirational, but I think that's what we should aim for.
So I want to make a point that might be a bit provocative, but I just start with I think over the last 10 years we have come a long way, and Simon and others have been very heavily involved in that, and you're both very involved in some of what we're doing at Cancer Research UK to involve patients much more in the sort of work that we do. So, I would say I think we have come a long way from a research funding point of view, which is not to say we don't have further to go. But I would make the observation that I think that's working now a lot better at the sort of strategic and funding and sort of population level. But it's a far cry from what happens on the ground when a patient is in front of their doctor, when the doctor is still saying to the patient, you should, rather than what do you think? And I think that is so embedded in the culture of how medicine is delivered that that's where I would like to see a huge amount of progress in the next 10 or 15 years, which is to say, let's really start to benefit from the knowledge that a patient has about how they're responding or how they might like to respond to a certain set of treatments that might be on offer, rather than simply everything being driven from the clinician. And I think we've got a long, long way to go on that score.
Okay. There's a question here, I think, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Bob Evans. I'm a volunteer lay committee member at the Royal College of Anaesthetists, and I think we've had a question thrown out about the training of people in the NHS in the future. And at the Royal College of Anaesthetists, the lay people have always been very concerned about the development and training of communication skills within medical professionals. We've had a very clear example here from Sir Harpal, who in a couple of seconds taught me more about cancer research, about the weeds in Romania, with a good example like that. Such clarity of information and expression is really quite inspirational, and I think that's what we look to in the future. I think the other point to remember is that the GMC in setting regulations in the medical world are requiring, on a mandatory basis, more and more patient and public involvement. I just wonder if there's anybody from the GMC here today. Probably speaks volumes, actually, but there we are. So I think communication is a vital factor in the future. And if I may, just one comment, a commission really to every single person in this room. In 2017, see if you can't find somebody, it doesn't matter what their background is, the more diverse the better, I think, for the sake of the nation's health. If you can find just one person to serve on a patient committee or a medical royal college or participate in a clinical trial or something like that, that would be wonderful and a legacy of this first conference. And when you come back for the second one next November, then you'll all be able to report back that you've signed somebody up.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I'll take it. Yeah, please.
Just a quick comment on that one, because one of the areas where we have seen some improvement there in the regulatory sort of setting rather than the GMC is when we look at the MHRA and the EMA and our drug regulatory agencies. They are getting better at involving patients in that benefit risk assessment of therapies as they come through. I still think there's a long way to go. We have a very, well, I use patriarchal in sort of, but we have a very sort of patriarchal type hierarchical drug regulation system here, is that I look at the data that we present and I decide whether I think the benefit to the patient is worth the risk that they might take with a new therapy. And if I think that looks like the benefit is better than the risk, I will send that to the regulatory colleagues in the MHRA or the EMA, and they will also make that assessment. But actually, generally, none of us are the patient with that disease. And actually, it is their disease, it is their risk and their benefit. And I do think there is more to be done in terms of involving our patients in that drug regulatory benefit risk assessment. We have seen some steps, which is great to see the MHRA. You know, we are bringing patients into that, but it's an important one. It's not my disease, it's somebody else's, but I still make the benefit risk assessment.
Okay, any more patient views? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put the panel slightly on the spot and ask them to tell us one thing that they're going to do or start doing tomorrow at work to put patients first and realise their vision for the future of science, medicine and health research.
Okay, who wants to start?
So I'm going to take Jane's message about having patients on at the beginning of meetings or conferences rather than in the middle at the end. We've done that a little, but we don't do it routinely. So that's something that I'm going to be taking back.
Harpal?
Well, I hope we do put patients first, and I genuinely mean that. Our entire organisation is driven by what we want to achieve for patients. But given your challenge, I mean, I think the last point that was just mentioned, you know, interpreting the results of trials, what we don't do is bring patients who are directly affected by those trials at the end of the trials to understand how we best interpret those results. So I think that's a really good takeaway for me.
Sue?
I would build upon the work that certainly I've done already to make sure that patients are embedded in all of the work that we've done in the NHS and the broader work around the 100,000 Genomes Project. We've got much to build on, but I don't think any of us should be complacent. There's always more we can do, and there's always more that we can learn from patients, but also from their carers. And I'm really keen that we think about this together, and that we really are reflective of the population in this country, rather than perhaps a polarised part of the country.
Yeah. A lot of my work is advising life science companies on strategy and advising investors. And I guess a lot of that's what's driven around is numbers and coming up with a business case. Now, we do consult with patient groups, but it's more to sort of inform on market share and those sorts of things. So I think it's a question of getting more of the intangible benefits or yet to be measurable benefits into those sorts of analyses. And in fact, we worked on parts of the accelerated access review, as did Richard Barker, who I can see in the audience as well. And patients did feature quite very strongly in that, in terms of a voice informing a lot of the strategic recommendations we're coming up with, to the point that I think it's a very robust strategy that's there that has got a very big chance of success. So that experience, I think, has taught me in my organisation how critical the voice of the patient is.
I'm going to cheat slightly, because this is going to be redouble my efforts to do something rather than start it completely new. Having spent the first 10 years or probably even 15 years in industry trying to remove subjective qualitative statements in clinical trials about what patients feel, because how on earth can I measure that? We've actually, over the last couple of years, really been redoubling our efforts on how can we sort of find out from patients their experience of being in the trial, experience of the therapies. And it's not a for a sponsor company, it's not a straightforward question, because we have built as a society, quite rightly, and we've had comfort in this sort of arm's length relationship with patients in clinical trials, so that it doesn't seem as though I'm trying to influence the result in any way. But I think there is a huge amount to be gained by listening to patients who've been part of those trials and who've had that therapy and think beyond what the regulatory endpoint is. And we're currently working out what is the best way to do that, talking to patients, talking to regulatory colleagues, to make sure it's compliant, but also to make sure we hear that voice. So it's going to be to redouble the efforts to sort of make sure we find a way to listen to patients who've been through the trials.
Okay, thanks. We've got a few more minutes maybe for other questions from the hall who might have... Do I see any hands? Higher up. There's one in the middle there, please. Yeah.
This is Madhu from MRC Technology. Just a quick question around rare disease. Is there anything we can learn from what is happening in that area? Because that area has been historically very much driven by patients, not only from the awareness perspective, but over the past 2-3 years, it has really taken a new life. Is there anything that you want to share, any of the panelists?
Okay, let me see if there's a couple of others, and then we'll take them together. Anybody else? Yep, one at the front here.
I just got a bit of a question around sort of representation of more vulnerable groups. It seems like I've been to some of the talks on the sort of technologies and everything that are coming in, and there seems to be lots of smart technologies that may be useful for smart people, and that it will increase the gap between the people who can manage these and articulate them and run with the new technologies and the people who can't or won't or just don't have access to it. So it seems that there's good stuff there, but sometimes it can be divisive stuff.
Okay, thanks. Maybe anybody else? Please shout it. Yeah, please. One more. Have I missed anybody else? Yeah,
William Bernhoff, paediatrician. I think one of the points I want to make is we've spent the last 10 years or so, especially with the focus of NHR, really improving how we deliver clinical trials and clinical studies and getting patients to recruit. But every day, almost every day in that last 10 years, I've been trying to work to help people do that. And we still are significant numbers of clinical studies, perhaps between 10 and 30% overall, that don't quite recruit the right numbers of patients. And one of the key problems that we see in that situation is that the trial doesn't quite match what the patients are really doing in real life. So I think part of the funding problem that's been alluded to is the fact that money is being spent at the back end of research to keep it going and in extensions, when we actually need to spend some of that money up front to get the patients in, to get the protocols better, and try and increase the performance of our research with more meaningful patient-focused trials.
Okay, thanks. So we've got those three themes: the trial, recruitment and structure, the issue of lessons from rare diseases, and the sort of technology gap, as it were, if I can put it that way. Who might like to come in on any of those?
Can I pick up on rare diseases? You've heard today about the 100,000 Genomes Project, and this is a project that's really telling us a lot about rare disease in terms of, for example, the healthcare utilisation of these patients that have stretched over many years without a diagnosis. So we definitely have to learn from that project in terms of what this means for rare disease going forward, and also what that means in terms of drug development, the potential costs when the potential numbers of patients to treat will be much smaller. So I think this will give us a real exemplar set of pathways about how the relationships between all parts of the system need to work together in the future.
Thought I might just comment on the question on smart technologies and the widening of the gap as I think you posed the question. And I guess I would turn it round the other way and say that it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that the gap doesn't widen and to think about clever solutions for doing so. And let me just give two illustrations of why I'm optimistic on that score. So we've had for many years in this country a cervical screening programme which is very effective, but it isn't translatable to low-income countries in a very easy way. But now that we've understood much better what to look for and how to look for it, we now have in some countries in the world a much simpler test, which is very inexpensive. It's not quite as good as what we do here in the UK, but it's good enough. And knowing what to look for can lead to better solutions, simpler solutions. The second example I would give is this one here in my pocket, which is this is a very, very smart piece of technology, but I won't get the number exactly right. About 70% of the UK population now is very comfortable using one of these, and it's because someone's thought about how to make this easy to use. And just as someone's thought about how to make this easy to use, so we need to find ways of making all the technologies we develop easy to use so that we don't disenfranchise the people who would otherwise be disadvantaged by those things that we develop. It's possible to do it.
Okay. I'll quickly answer. Oh, sorry. Maybe two on rare diseases and what we can learn from them. I think one is around patient data, because then what we find is patients are more willing to share data and their families. So again, and also new funding mechanisms. So crowdfunding, etc. And there's a company called Genathon in France, which does crowdfunding, but also invests in pharmaceutical development and manufacture through outsourced relationships. And on smart tech, I think Internet of Things can really help bridge that gap and that technology divide and actually facilitate living within technology. When you look at the smart pill dispensers, effective devices at home for the elderly.
The question about investment at the front end of trials, I think, is a very valid point, because quite often, as you said, we get 3 months into a trial that's supposed to take 5 months, and we've still only recruited a handful of people. And we have now, we do routinely ask patients or members from Patient Association to look at the protocols for us. And we had a recent one with it's an anti-epilepsy drug. It's a first time we were going into patients, so we were a little bit concerned about it. But we were going into a patient population that had really nothing else. So these were patients who either their only other option was surgery, and epilepsy surgery is essentially taking pieces of the brain out. And some of them actually had failed the assessment for that. So one very clear message was everybody wanted an opportunity to be on the drug. So we designed the trial so that although we had a placebo control arm at the beginning, we actually switched that to everybody got the drug for actually the bulk of the time that they were on the trial. There are some challenges with doing that, but that's one example of where we've tried to listen. I do think, though, it's a very valid question, and we also need to think about our clinical trial, how we run those clinical trials and write those protocols, because one of the challenges is it's quite an administrative burden to change those protocols, and so we're very reluctant to do it until we know is it really not working, or we're just not looking hard enough, and by then we're well into the trial. And I think we need to think about better ways to manage that so we can adapt more flexibly to do that. So that was that one. I had one question about the technology. Is a very interesting one, because we need that leading edge of technology. So in my world, next generation sequencing is old hat. So technology is coming in here, but actually we're looking at single cell transcription, we're looking at bead technologies, and the challenge for that is there's half a dozen centers in the world that can do this. It provides a great deal of biological knowledge, but my big concern is how do I then make that accessible to a clinical community and a clinical population? And so some of that is we learn the technology to learn the signals, to learn what we need to measure, and then we go back to a more, a better established technology to put it into the clinical care community. And you've seen that in oncology, that some of the initial, although we can do sequencing and we can look at some molecular technologies, immunohistochemistry was still the bedrock of personalized therapies at the beginning, because it was in every hospital and you could do it. And that's still something we need. We need that technology breaking boundaries, but we need to make sure it's linked and pull through to some of the more established approaches as well. But it keeps me awake at night.
Louise, we're getting the red card, but I'll give you then the final
Just
word.
really quickly then. So I think one of the other things that we can learn from rare diseases is around what makes effective collaboration, because essentially researchers have to collaborate in order to recruit patients to their studies. So we can learn about collaboration here, use of model agreements to speed things up, but also cross-border collaboration, what works well. And there's a great story to be told in rare diseases. To your question about digital, great for the 70%. Even when it gets to 90%, that's great. But I think I'm like you. I am worried that there will be a digital divide for a sector of our population, and we're going to have to ensure that we put in place mechanisms that enable those people to be approached about opportunities to participate in research and so on. You know, it's great we've got lots of digital opportunities, but that's not going to be job done for the whole population.
Okay, well, thanks very much. A very important sort of reminder and final point. And thank you all for a great panel and some excellent thoughts. Hopefully you can stay also informally afterwards for some informal conversation over drinks, but do please thank our panel.